Record. How you doing, Benjamin?
Sorry, I missed last week.
No, that's okay. No, things happen, things come up. Everybody's busy. I get it. Um, the recording is online if you need to look at that or anything like that. So, okay, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up PowerPoint here. All right, here we go. All right, so we are covering chapters 11 and 13 tonight. So Congress and the courts. Cut off there. That's
About 12.
So what's that?
What about 12?
Oh, so that's next week, right? So 12 and 15 are next week. So I like to cover the executive branch and the bureaucracy together because you're tying in, executing public policy with the administrative agency. So it makes a lot of sense to carry those together. So good question though. All right. So that being said, we are in the home stretch. I think we have about 10 more days left for this course. So it moves very quickly. Everybody's doing very well. Everything's been graded up to this point. If you have any questions about anything, please let me know. The first exam has been curved 10 points. Those points have been entered. So whatever you see on Blackboard now in the grade book is your score with that additional 10 points.
So I had like an 81 something.
What's that?
So if I had an 81, does that get bumped up to a 91?
Yeah, if you had an 81, you would get a 91. Yep. So just going back and look at the questions that seemed like maybe were more problematic than others. Just going through and providing some points, a little bit of a buffer for everybody. So that helps out. Everybody got them, even if the 10 points gets you over 100%, you still get the points. If one person gets them, they all get them. You all get them. So just make sure you go ahead and know where you're at in the course as we close out. Reminder: the Civil Liberties political cartoon due this Saturday. Okay, by 11:59. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. The discussion board, your last discussion board will be posted. The question will be posted tomorrow. So your first post will be due by 11:59 on Sunday. And then your second post responding to a classmate will be due by 11:59 on Tuesday. All right. In addition, your last two quizzes will be due by 11:59 on Tuesday as well. They'll be a little bit longer because I just have to get up to the points. They'll be worth twice as much as we normally would, 2 points instead of 1. But that doesn't really matter. As long as you're taking the quiz, you can take them as many times as you want. You can get all the points. That'll round us up to the 100 points you need for the class as far as quizzes go. And once that Tuesday comes around, you're just about done with the course. All right, there's going to be 2 outstanding exams or assignments you have to worry about. So one is the apply your knowledge question 2. So I will post that tomorrow. You'll have until next Saturday to complete it. What date is that? I think that's the 9th. So you'll have that, and then on the following Monday, the last day of the course, Monday the 11th, you'll take your final exam. Okay, same process through Blackboard. The only difference is I haven't decided on this 100%, but the only difference that'll be you might have a 1 or 2 short answer questions on the exam. Other than that, you'll take the exam the exact same way through Blackboard, primarily multiple choice. And then I'll submit. Once you submit that, that'll all be graded. I'm going to jump on and grade your apply your knowledge assignment right away. And by that Tuesday or Wednesday, the 12th or 13th of October, you'll have your grade. The grades will be submitted. So comes up fast. But the good thing is you're almost done with me. You don't have to, who knows? You might never see me again. But everyone's doing well in this class. You know, if you're struggling on anything, let me know. But we're winding down here, so just keep up the strong effort, and you'll do just fine. So any questions about any of these announcements? Okay. All right. Well, we're covering Congress tonight. We're covering the courts. I expect, what is it, about 5 after 6 now. By 7 o'clock, I expect to be through the chapter on Congress. We'll take a short break, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back, do the courts, and my goal is by 8 o'clock, maybe shortly thereafter, we'll wrap up. And then I can answer any questions you might have about the material or anything else that's due, any questions about the civil liberties political cartoon, whatever the case might be. So we'll leave some time for that, but also, you know, let you jump off early. I know everybody's got other things to do, or maybe you jump off early and work on the political cartoon, whatever you need to get done. Fair enough? All right. So that's our goal for tonight. Like I said, just to be done by shortly after 8 o'clock. All right. So as we start talking about Congress, right now we've moved into the institutional component of the class, right? We talked, as you know, we talked about the founding of the country at the beginning, right? We talked about foundational values of the country. We talked about civil liberties and civil rights, where those components are found in the Constitution, why they were so important, right? Not only our freedoms, but due process and being treated fairly and equally under the law, right? All those foundational principles. Then in Unit 2, we moved into the political component, right? All the political players, whether it be us as we deal with public opinion and voting and elections, the political parties, the interest groups, the media, all those political players and how they interact with each other in this political process that we find ourselves in. Now we're into the institutional unit, right? We're going to be talking about Congress and the courts, right? Two of the branches of government. And then next week we'll talk about the executive, and along with the executive, the bureaucracy, right? Because bureaucracy, we're talking about administrative agencies that the executive, right, the president of the United States oversees, or at least is responsible. Okay, and then that'll round us out here. So Congress, right? Congress is a fundamental institution. You know, when the framers crafted the federal government, we look back at all the institutions. The framers put most of the work in the language in the Constitution into the powers of Congress. Congress was seen as a cornerstone of the Republic. Anybody want to tell us why, or guess why, or share their thoughts on why Congress was the cornerstone of the Republic? It has to do with representation, right? Closest to the people, right? The House of Representatives, it's elected those members are elected every 2 years. Why every 2 years? It seems like we always have another congressional election, because it's designed to be responsive to the voters, to the constituents, right? The Congress was set up so that they directly represent us, right? They're different parts of the country, different interests are represented within that legislative body, and it's the closest to the people, and it can tap into the demands of the public. So Congress is fundamental, right? It is a preeminent institution within our system of government, very important. But that being said, we have this paradox of Congress. We want it to be, it's important. We want it to reflect our values. We want it to reflect our interests. But we have a situation in which Congress, does anybody know where the approval rating for Congress is kind of hovering right now, or just in general in the last handful of years where it's been? You're talking 11, 12, 14, 15%, right? Low teens, low, maybe up, sometimes up to mid-teens, but you're hovering. It's been as low as the high single digits, those kind of things. So we have this really important institution, but the favorability of Congress is always very low, right? So, yeah, so that's kind of a terrible thing. But then if you look, the paradox comes in where you have the members of Congress, they're elected at a rate of over 90%. So the success of incumbents, you're in the 90% success rate, but in the low teens or high single digits, that is the approval rating of Congress. How can this be? Well, the fact is that people typically approve of their member of Congress, right? Either their senators, maybe one or both of their senators, sometimes none, but they like their member of Congress. Their member of Congress might be active in the community, be visible, might have helped them with something. We'll talk about the things that members of Congress can do to help their constituents. But when it comes to the individual members of Congress, people tend to like their member of Congress. What they see as problematic is other members of Congress that don't support their values, but then they look at their member and then the rest of the institution. So we get this strange paradox, and we'll show kind of some information about that as we go. But it's important to note that this paradox exists, even though it's such an important institution. So how does Congress operate, right? How do members get elected, right? Pretty simple. There's a process for getting on the ballot, to accessing the ballot, running for office. Individuals run in a congressional district, or they run statewide as U.S. senators, right? Some states only have one congressional district, so essentially the House member is essentially running statewide as well. But they get elected by the districts in the House, and of course, the statewide in the Senate. Right? So what is the structure? We've talked, you had the first apply your knowledge questions addresses this, but what does the structure of Congress look like? Who can tell us that? How is Congress structured? Anybody? Everyone did well and they apply the knowledge. I'm sure you know, right? How is it structured? How is it set up? How is it organized? All right, well, I'll help you guys out. Maybe you've had a long day, so we'll kind of keep moving. But the structure of Congress is bicameral, right? We've seen that, right? We've talked about the Virginia plan, we talked about the New Jersey plan, the Connecticut Compromise, all these different ideas that were going around. Well, how do we do this? Well, it's structured that you have the House of Representatives is based on population, right? So you have that is proportional based on a state's total population. And then you have another chamber, the Senate, which where you have representation based on this principle of one state, one vote, right? So each state gets 2 votes, regardless of size, geographic size, regardless of population, right, to balance out the demands of the different plans at the time. And decisions are made, right? You have decisions being made in the House, right? Not only on legislation, but House rules. The Senate, the same thing. And how are decisions made? Well, the way it was designed is to increase deliberation, is that legislation comes out of the House or goes through the House, comes out of the House, goes to the Senate, or vice versa. The 2 chambers have to approve the same legislation, the exact same legislation, and then it goes to the president for signature or veto or whatever the case might be. All right, so we've talked a lot about these. Everyone, like I said, did a nice job of examining those plans and what they meant when it came to representation. So that's how it was designed. All right. Like I said, the purpose of bicameralism was to, right, they had to resolve this issue of apportionment, right? Where how are these chambers going to represent the people, right? So they did that. They compromised on that. And that creates different types of representation, because originally, before the 17th Amendment, the US Senate, the senators were selected by the state legislatures. That now they're selected by popular election, but they were originally selected by state legislatures. So that was designed to ensure that the states felt connected to the federal government. They felt like they had skin in the game, but it also creates different types of representation. The House of Representatives being elected every 2 years, directly elected by the people, who could keep their finger on the pulse of what people cared about. And then the US senators, kind of once removed, being elected by the general assemblies of the different states. You got a different type of constituency. More, you can see it as more elite. The Senate was set up to be more deliberative, focused on continuity of government, right? Every 6 years, their terms lasting 6 years instead of the 2, right? So you have different types of representation. So that was designed that way, to try to get different types of representation within the chamber, the 2 chambers. Designed to slow legislation down, increase deliberation, right? People were concerned about a unicameral Congress in which things could move very quickly to the president. So the 2 chambers having to pass the same legislation does slow down the process. It can be frustrating, especially if the party you support controls Congress, but it's very difficult because of the different constituencies to get legislation passed. Bicameralism was set up to prevent fleeting instincts, right? Very passionate demands on Congress to pass, right? If something was fleeting, but people were very passionate about it, we wanted to kind of quell those passions and increase deliberation. If it's just a fleeting instinct, we want to be able to slow that down and make sure it's something that Congress really should be doing. And then, of course, to prevent a single faction from enacting laws, right? So breaking up the Congress, having different types of representation does that. So you have some social class biases, right? House members directly elected by the people, senators chosen by the state legislatures until the 17th Amendment. You have the length of terms that are different, 2 versus 6 in the Senate, right? So those are all different. So where are we seeing? We've talked a little bit about apportionment, right? How many members of the House each state gets, right? This issue as the country was growing, this issue kind of came to a head with the 1920 census. After the 1920 census, reapportionment wasn't done. There was this big dispute between rural areas and urban areas. The rural areas were really concerned about the urban areas growing and getting more representation, right? Because Congress was still growing at that time, right? Prior to 1920, right? The number of seats in the House continued to grow based on the size of the population. Well, that stopped after 1920. There was no reapportionment. And then in the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 set the House of Representatives at 435 seats, where it's remained over 100 years later. So the purpose there, as you can see down there, right, it's trying to address this conflict between representation and efficiency.
If there being 100 seats in the Senate, that's 535, and then with 3 more to 538 for the Electoral College.
That's correct, right? That's correct. Yep. So that's where you get the 5. That's where you kind of get that road to 270. You divide 538 by 2 and then plus the 1. Yep. To get the majority. Very good. So, the idea was that for having 435 House members, that you're trying to balance representation with efficiency. So now you have
or the extra 3 seats in addition to the House and Senate.
Say that again.
Because there's 435 seats in the House and 100 in the Senate is 535, but then there's 3 more spots for the 538. What are those 3 for?
Those three are for, and I'm sorry, if you asked that question just a second ago, I didn't catch it, I apologize. Those other three are from the District of Columbia. So they get, when it comes to presidential elections, they get 3 electoral votes. So that's where the other 3 come from. They're not represented in Congress with formal votes, but Washington, D.C. does provide delegates to Congress that they caucus with the representatives, the members of the House, but they're not voting members. Okay, but very good question. So this balance between efficiency and representation right now, on average, congressional House members, they represent on average 650,000 people, right? That can be as low as 3 or 350, can go up to as much as around 1 million, right? Depending, right? Because the House is set, right? So as each state gets at least one member of the House, right? So you might have a population of only a state with only, who knows, like 300,000 or 400,000 people, right? Or they might have a state with like 1 million people, and they get to divide that by 2 maybe. And so each district is 500,000 people. So as you're moving these pieces on the board, these puzzle pieces on the board, it can increase it by as much as, let's say, around 1 million to down to 350,000, but about 650,000 is the average. We've talked in the past about the 3/5 compromise and how important that was in the deliberations of the country's founding. And then you go. So Benjamin asked a great question about Washington, D.C. So again, they get delegates to Congress, right? They're non-voting members, but they do have a say in the presidential elections when it comes to elect members of the Electoral College. All right. So this is the congressional apportionment based on the 2020 census. So we'll see that play out, and it's already playing out in the 2020 census, but the number there is the number of House members there. And then as I think Benjamin also pointed out, so you see in Florida, 27 House members plus 2 senators, that's 29 electoral votes in the presidential election. So your 2 senators. All right, but this is right, because you can see Montana, Wyoming, right? You're North Dakota, South Dakota. You only have Delaware as well. Vermont, you have 1 congressional district. So those House members, they run statewide, essentially statewide as well. All right. So when we talk about apportionment, what are we trying to get to, right? So apportionment is this idea, right? We're trying to say, right, based on the population, where the population lives, how it's shifted from year to year, you have to reapportion the states. You have to tell them every 10 years how many districts the state legislature has to draw for the next 10 years, right? Some states pick up congressional seats, some lose, some stay the same, right? States that only have 1, the chances of them getting a second one, right? I mean, unless a lot of people move there, isn't going to happen, but they're never going to lose that 1, right? So a lot of things go into that. So that's telling every 10 years, that's telling the states how many districts they get. Now, once the states know that, the general assemblies of the state get that number, then they have to go back. Now they have to go and draw district lines. So you get a portion, and then the state legislatures, they redistrict. Okay, the districts have to be essentially just within a small percentage difference, have to be relatively equal. But we get into this question of gerrymandering, right? This goofy way of drawing district lines to kind of capitalize on voters in different areas, right? So is anybody familiar with gerrymandering?
Yes.
Why are you laughing?
I'm laughing because I do not like when the Republican states just gerrymander to make sure a Republican candidate wins.
Okay, do you like it when Democrats do it?
I like it when Democrats do it, just not when Republicans do it.
You know what? I appreciate your honesty. You know what? I appreciate your honesty in that, because that's, that's how we feel a lot of times. Oh, our party, our party is doing the right thing. The other party is doing the wrong thing, but both parties do it, right? They do it, right? They want to give themselves an advantage for the next 10 years. And they draw not only congressional district lines, but they're drawing state legislative lines. And then counties can change their district lines.
Yep, my mom doesn't think it should be done at all.
What's that?
My mom thinks there should be no gerrymandering.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that there's fair maps, like where I came from, like where I grew up, where I lived for most of my life in Illinois. There's, they've been pushing for this fair map amendment to the Constitution that provides that allows for data to be implemented, be inputted into a computer districts, essentially divides up, creates districts based on population, and there's parameters about how condensed the lines have to be, how contiguous the district can be. Now Iowa, well, way ahead of the game. They have that system. Other states have, they kind of implement some of that, but most states have kept the political district drawing because they want it to be continue to be advantageous for their political party, right? So it makes it very difficult for the other party to compete, especially in these heavy blue states, heavy red states, right? Where you have overwhelming, like I said, in where I'm at in Tennessee, right? It's overwhelming, right? You have pockets of blue, right? It's red with purple kind of polka dots in different areas like Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, right? So you have these purple polka dots, but the Republicans control the state legislature by heavy margins, so they can draw these lines, right? Democrats do the same thing. I've lived with Democrats in Illinois too. They do these things, right? So there's advantages to having a deep blue state or deep red state for that particular party. So the two main strategies that political parties use are packing and cracking. Can anybody tell me what those two things are? All right, so packing is, let's say, so let's take a Republican, since Benjamin mentioned it. Let's take a Republican state, and let's say they look at the map and they see places like in Nashville, and what the Republicans in the state legislature do is they try to capture as many Democrats as they can, and they pack them into one district, and that district is going to vote for a Democrat. Why would they do that? Why would Republicans pack so many Democrats into a district that Republicans could never win? Well, they do it to dilute Democrat support in the surrounding congressional districts. So if they pack all those Democrats into one district, then those Democrats aren't in surrounding districts, diluting Republican support. Okay, so they do that. They say, okay, we'll throw away that district. We'll give that, Republicans say, we'll give that district to the Democrats, or vice versa in a blue state. We'll say, okay, they can have that district, but we'll be successful in all the surrounding districts. So they're packing their opposing party support in one area, right? And that district, that person might win, might be in a safe district then, might win by 55, 60, 70, 80%, fine, but right, then not a lot of Democrat support in the surrounding areas. Cracking is saying, look, we're going to take a pocket of opposition party support and we're going to break it up. We're going to draw districts so that we're breaking up that support and saying, okay, well, in this congressional district over here, we have a large majority. We'll put a few, let's keep with the theme, Republicans, right? Republicans drawing them out. We'll put a few Democrats in this district, a few Democrats in this district, and just kind of divide them up. That way, the Democrats don't have any congressional districts or very few, but they don't, in the Republican districts, the Democrats don't have enough support to win a majority and get their members of the House elected. So packing and cracking. And part of this gerrymandering process, which, it's interesting, even people that say gerrymandering's bad, you start talking about this idea of minority majority districts, where you're gerrymandering districts, you're drawing a district so that a minority, right, a racial cultural minority can have the majority of the numbers, the voters in that district. Let's say Black, Hispanic, Asian, right, whatever the case might be, you're drawing a minority majority district. A lot of times people say, well, they might not necessarily have a problem with that, right? Because the idea behind that is to allow minorities the opportunity to send somebody from their community to Congress, right? That shares the same cultural values, same race, whatever the case might be. So people have challenged that. Not everybody agrees with that, but that's one of the ways gerrymandering has been used, is to create these minority majority districts. This is an example. This is Austin, Texas, right? 2003 to 2015. This is an example of cracking. Okay, Austin is a Democratic area in Austin, Texas, right? So what did the Republicans do? The Republicans looked at that, and over time, as the population continued to grow, right, they said, okay, we're just going to break up that support, that Democrat support. We're going to break them up and say we're going to send them into these surrounding Republican districts. Okay, Austin, the city of Austin, is now represented by 6 different congressional representatives because the Republicans have cracked up that area. Just one example. This is not too far from where I lived in Illinois. Okay, this is the 4th congressional of Illinois. Still looks like this. This is an example of a minority majority district. This is a Hispanic district, right? There is a Hispanic representative member of Congress that has been elected ever since this map was drawn. It was designed to accomplish what it did, right? To give, right, the Hispanic members of that community, right, the ability to send a Hispanic member of Congress to Washington, D.C. So this is one of the goofiest districts as far as it being drawn, right? Because it just creates the C in different areas, right around Oak Park. And it's just one of those things, a different example of how to go about drawing maps. All right, so the powers of Congress. All right, so remember, I want you to understand what apportionment is, reapportionment, redistricting is. That's very important. I'm telling you, for the final, that's going to be very important. So what powers does Congress have, right? We talk about enumerated powers. These are powers that are granted specifically in the Constitution to Congress. The first 17 clauses, right? The founders put a lot of ink on paper when it comes to the powers of Congress. So the first 17 clauses of Article 1, Section 8 specify the enumerated powers, the spelled out powers of Congress, right? The powers of the Senate to confirm nominees, to approve treaties, the oversight function of Congress, the ability to create constitutional amendments for the states to ratify, right? So the Congress has a lot of power there. In addition, they have power through the necessary and proper clause, which we've talked a little bit about. So this elastic clause, they have these implied powers. Okay, so what's necessary and proper to carry out their enumerated powers falls under the necessary and proper. All right, so what are some checks on Congress? Can anybody name any? Anybody? Well, let me go back. I'm just wanted to see if the chat was. All right. Nobody can name any? Come on, I bet you can. Checks on Congress. I'll start you out, right? The presidential veto, right? Anything else? Or you guys are making me work today. That's okay. All right. The Supreme Court, right? Ruling what Congress can do, whether or not they're allowed to do it. Okay, that's very important. Okay, right. So Marbury versus Madison. We'll talk about judicial review in a minute. But the Supreme Court checks whether or not Congress is doing something constitutional. The electorate, us, right? We put a check on Congress, right? We have regular elections. That's important. And then the Senate and the House, they check each other, right? In that bicameral structure, they check each other. All right, so this is just a picture as in your text about the war powers of the president versus Congress, and that's waxed and waned over time as presidents have acted in a way. Sometimes Congress lets the president act, right? With Truman as it relates to the Korean War. Sometimes Congress has clawed some of those powers back. All right. So the differences in the House and the Senate, this is kind of just that, that bread and butter constitutional type information. It's good to know. It's always good to get a refresher. You probably know a lot of these things already, right? The terms, we've talked about them already. The House, 2-year terms. The Senate, 6-year terms. They are staggered in the Senate, right? A third of the Senate is elected every 2 years. They're staggered. The House, right, being 2-year terms, the whole House runs for election every 2 years. So you could theoretically have 100% turnover in the House. The chances of that happening are probably slim to none because you have so many safe districts. But right, that's right. The House is designed to be more responsive. So let's talk about who runs, right? Typically, the framers wanted to leave it, leave ballot access, have a low bar on ballot access, meaning they wanted to make it relatively easy, have few restrictions on who could actually run for office, right? So you meet age requirements, meet citizenship requirements, boom, and you're there, you could run, right? But does that mean all these different kinds of people run? No, right? You still have a particular type of individual that runs for office, right? It's not universal, but you're not having, 435 average Joes running every 2 years, right? It's a different type of individual that runs for Congress. This is kind of a breakdown. It's kind of interesting. You look at the age, right? Members of Congress are typically older than the US population average. The percent minority is lower. The percent church members, it's usually higher. Why is that? There's still, we talk about separation of church and state. We talk about a lot of different things, but there's still political currency in being a member of a church. You talk about, look at President Biden, right? Where people talk about his Catholic faith and whether or not he adheres to his faith. But either way, throughout his career, President Biden has, right, reiterated his Catholic faith and how that has informed decisions that he makes or his life, things like that, right? So that's nothing new. Members of Congress, they think it's desirable to be members of a church. And I'm not saying that they go and become a member of a church because it's politically advantageous, but they do highlight that they have their beliefs are grounded in faith in one shape or another, right? The breakdown of the different faiths, at least the top 3 there, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. See the percent female, right? The lawyers, right? A lot of lawyers compared to from a percentage standpoint, compared to the population. Blue collar occupation, right? That's reversed. Military veteran, right? Again, veterans run for office. They run for office because they want to serve. But again, there's political capital in being a veteran, right? People respect veterans. They have a particular set of life experiences that can be advantageous in Congress. So there's a benefit of being a veteran and running for Congress. Percent of households earning $50,000 or more, right? 42% in the US population, 100% in Congress, right? Because their salaries are just under $200,000, right? So of course, you're going to make more than $50,000 a year if you're making $175,000. And then assets. This is the big one, right? it costs a lot of money to run for office, right? The congressional level. So people with money and resources tend to be more, they have more capacity to run because they have access to those resources, right? I mean, think about this, right? You have the Georgia 6, in the most expensive House race until 2014 was for John Boehner, right? 17 million, he spent 17 million to hold on to his seat, right? The most expensive congressional race total, both sides, was 2017, 40 million. 40 million. So money at this level is pretty substantial. All right. And then we talk about why incumbents win, why that paradox, why are members of Congress so successful? Well, they have an incumbent advantage. Okay. They have name recognition, right? They're covered in the press, they're on TV, they're covered in the national media, the local media. So they put out, they put out information about what's going on in a variety of different ways. So people get to know them and their name. They're the ones that are getting party support, right? Between staff, financial resources. A lot of them live in safe, represent safe seats. So a safe seat is where you have, you win by 55% or more of the vote. So they're rarely primaried. They're well known. If they get to the general election, many of them, don't have a problem winning a general election. Sometimes they don't even have an opponent because of the makeup of the seat. They have a network of fundraisers, and of course they can engage. I talked about this earlier. What can I do, right? This paradox, right? Why am I so popular in my own district, but Congress is unpopular? Well, because I'm out there doing casework for constituents. I have a staff helping people get their veteran benefits, finding a Social Security check that was lost, navigating a difficult bureaucracy. Members of Congress and their staffs help constituents, and that helps them with re-election. You think about it, even if you had an opposing party member of Congress, if they were able to help you get your veteran benefits, for example, you think you might vote for that person the next election? There's a better chance than there was before that person helped you, regardless of party affiliation, but that matters when you're doing something for somebody, all right? And you can see this is just the re-election rates of incumbents, right? You see House and the Senate in pink, and then look at these rates, right? A lot of time, like I said, it's over, 90%. So it's the advantage is substantial. Okay. Voters tend to focus on the national issues. Why do they focus on the national issues? Because that's what gets the most press. That's what their members are talking about. That's what they hear the most about, even on social media. Think about it. How often are you seeing, local issues on social media? You do, right? If you've kind of set up your connections that way to see that local news. But a lot of times what fills our social media pages are these national issues. So voters tend to focus on these national issues because that's what's being pumped into through their TV, on their phones, and that in turn filters into their network, and that's what their network's talking about, right? How about, are we talking about, when's the last time you heard a story about a staffing shortage at the Public Works Department where you live? Okay, I don't know, right? But when's the last time you heard about the immigration situation at the border? I don't know, just about every day, 100 times a day, right? I mean, so you see these.
What about the
issues
capital
become
tax
national
on
issues.
6 January?
Say that again.
What about capital tax on 6 January? How often do we
Right, so
hear
you
about
have,
that?
so you have, do you say we do hear about it or we don't hear about it? Go ahead.
We do hear about it still.
Yeah, right, we still
Have a
hear
huge
about it, right?
impact.
You have a commission that's investigating it, right? A court that just
You have people involved getting arrested.
right, yep, and a court that told the Capitol Police they had to release footage of there. You have a commission investigating what happened. You have the FBI that is has and is charging people based on their actions that day, right? And if you think you're hearing about it a lot now, guess what? The 2022 midterm, that is going to be on a perpetual loop with Democrat candidates, right? Democrat candidates that are in a fight for their political lives, guess what? They're going to be painting the Republican candidate as what, right? A Trump January 6th insurrectionist, right? I'm just putting on my campaign hat, right? Now, right? And then what the Republicans are going to do? The Republicans are going to focus on, right, socialist Democrats that are spending too much. They're trying to create a welfare state. These are the talking points that you'll hear, but that goes to the point. All these issues become national issues. And then voters tend to vote, right? Their parties are so far apart these days that voters tend to vote a straight ticket, right? There's not a lot of crossover, even with independents, even those that say that, well, we're independent. Well, when it comes to voting, doesn't necessarily look that way. They tend to lean one way or the other. All right. So representation. So these members, they get elected. They go to Washington. They're representing a state or congressional district. How do they behave? Right. So there's a couple of different ways, a few different ways actually, to look at how a representative behaves. There's the trustee view of representation. And this is the view that someone says, you know what, I'm just going to vote what I think is best for the country or what I think is best for my state. And I'm just going to do that because I think it's the right thing to do, right? You're acting as a trusted representative, a trustee. Okay? A delegate view, an instructed delegate view of representation is when somebody does, okay, I'm going to, go back to public opinion, right? What is the public saying? What's going on in my state? What's going on in my congressional district? This is how the people that elected me feel. Okay, so I'm going to vote the way they feel, right? And you'll hear members of Congress, that's you. Sometimes it's true. A lot of times it's true, right? They want to run. They want to have a successful reelection, but it also gives them some cover too when they take a vote and they take a hit on it somewhere. They said, hey, my constituents said that that's what they wanted, so that's how I voted. Not necessarily my opinion, my belief, but I voted my constituents' beliefs, right? So at the end of the day, you don't have representatives vote one way or another. They typically have this political style where there's a combination of both. And there's times where they have to vote, like on a very passionate issue, let's say immigration or taxes, or there's a lot of different things. The military, things that are very divisive issues or that people care about, people have an opinion about. Representatives tend to be more instructed delegates. They say, well, my constituents are passionate about this issue, so I better do what they say. But if there's issues that their constituents don't really know about or don't care about, that gives a representative, a member of Congress, the ability, some flexibility to engage that issue as a trustee and say, well, this issue is important. My constituents don't really care or don't really know about it. The nation doesn't really know too much about it. So I'm going to vote as a trustee because I think it's the best thing to do. And they do that. They have the flexibility to do that because their constituents are less likely to hold them accountable because they're just not engaged on that issue. Okay. All right. So this is more of just kind of the makeup of Congress. You've seen these in your book, right? What the Congress makeup looks like. So Congress, what's their job? Why is it so important? Because they're creating the laws in the federal government, right? So how does this work, right? You have a lot of members, right? You have 535 members of Congress, as Benjamin said, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. How do you get these things done? How do you overcome this collective action problem? So when I say collective action, we're saying, how do we get a majority of those people moving in the same direction to pass legislation? It's hard. It's like herding cats because people will get elected from different states, different districts, their constituents demand different things, they care about different things, so they could be running in 535 different directions. Well, how do we get people on the same page? Well, they do that. Political parties have a role to play in that, especially when it comes to resources and party leadership and deciding what committees you get on. But there's pork barrel politics where you talk about, okay, hey, what can I put in this bill to appease you to get you to vote for it, right? Or they log roll and they say, okay, what can we trade? Okay, if I'm talking to Benjamin, okay, we're both members of Congress, and say, Benjamin, what can we trade here? Okay, or okay, you need my vote on your legislation. I need your vote on mine. Let's trade votes, right? So they go around trying to solve this collective action problem by log rolling, pork barrel politics, right? Engaging with their party, supporting their party, right? Because the party agenda, like, look right now, it's kind of, I don't think it's as dire for the Democratic Party as the talking heads on TV say. I think if it continues to go this way, it might be difficult in the midterm election. But we're approaching a do or die situation for the Democrats in Congress to pass substantial legislation that they think will be beneficial to their party in the midterm elections. If they're able to do that, they think that they'll be successful. If they're not able to do that, then, you know, they might have voters that say, well, kind of to hell with this. Why would we vote for you? You couldn't even get this done, whatever the case might be. So parties play a substantial role in kind of trying to whip those votes together to pass legislation that's important to, that's a significant part of the party's platform. All right. This is just another statistic about job approval for Congress. This is more constitutional components, right? But it's important to understand the formal leadership of the chambers, right? You have the House leadership, you have the Speaker of the House, which is a constitutional function. The majority leader, which is like essentially the right hand of the Speaker. The minority leader is the head of the party that's in the minority. And then there's whips within both parties. Those individuals in House leadership, right? They're the vote counters, right? They're talking, hey, what do we have to do to get you on board with this? What else do you need? Where are you at? What's going on? Same in the Senate. You have the president pro tem, right? The president, the temporary president, the president for the day, for the time being, right? Why do you have a president pro tem? Who's the president of the Senate? Who can help me out? Who's the president of the Senate? The US Senate.
Harris.
Harris, right? The vice president, right? So most of the time, the vice president is not acting in the role of president of the Senate. The vice president is doing other things. So the Senate, the majority appoints the president pro tem, and then you have the majority leader, right? Who and the minority leader, and then the whips, right? So those the two heads of, you have Schumer as the majority leader now. McConnell is the minority leader in the Senate, right? It's an evenly split, but with Harris, that gives the Democrats the majority, right? The Harris would be the vote breaker in that in a 50-50 split Senate, right? And then you can go back. I don't want to belabor this because for the most part, I kind of explained all of these things, but the House, with the rules of the House, because there's so many members, the Speaker in the House has a lot of power, right? With who gets on what committee, where legislation gets assigned to what committee, where it comes up on the vote, when it comes up on a vote, scheduling votes, very powerful position in there. So what I want you to focus on, this is really important when it comes to the House and Senate, how important. We don't necessarily see a lot of deliberations. We do a lot of deliberations on in the whole chamber, right? A lot of times we see, like where we've had the last couple of days with Milley and McKenzie, and now I'm drawing a blank. But they're in committee meetings asking questions, right? So a lot of things happen in committee. Legislation gets marked up. gets approved, gets sent out of committee to the House floor. So depending on the committees you're on, you have a lot of sway, especially if you're the chair of a committee. They're considered little legislatures because of how much power they have. Now, if a committee is not sending out legislation to the House floor, Senate floor, I mean, in the House, you can have a discharge petition where essentially you have to have a majority, 218 members, sign this discharge petition. It basically forces the committee chair to send that legislation out to the whole House. But that's rarely used. And it's rarely used because the members of Congress, they show deference to each other. And they said, I wouldn't want this to happen in my committee, so I'm not going to do that to you. So the discharge petition is rarely used. That gives the committee chairs a lot of power and control over legislation. All right. Different types of committees. You have a standing committee, a committee that exists, always exists. It's a permanent committee. Those are typically the committees that you see. You have a select committee, right? It's a temporary legislative committee established for a limited time period and for a special purpose, right? January 1, right? That is a select committee, right? It's temporary. It'll go away at some point. Okay, it's not going to be a standing committee. Then you have a joint committee. It's a legislative committee composed of members of both houses, both chambers of Congress, right? The goal is to get together and say, hash out differences in legislation to get it passed, right? So you have joint committees. All right, what are your differences on this? How do we get there? How do we get connected so that we can pass the same legislation? A conference committee is a special joint committee appointed to reconcile. I'm sorry, the joint committee, sometimes it throws me off too. So I apologize. So joint committee is designed with both members of both chambers. They're together. They come together in a joint committee to address issues within the operation of the chambers, right? So the rules, the actual operation of the two of Congress in itself, right? So how it operates. The conference committees addresses legislation. So the conference committee, they get together, they conference about hashing out differences in legislation. My apologies. Committee members, typically there's a seniority system that's not always followed and where you get appointed. But, you know, party leaders, they do tend to have their favorites. They want to appoint people to committees, especially important committees where they appoint people that share their values, that they know they can trust, they know they can work with. But a lot of times majority, the seniority system is very important, right? And also if you're from a safe seat, you're more likely to have a more high profile committee appointment because party leaders don't want to appoint you to a committee an important committee if you might lose the next election. Okay? This is the breakdown, right? How it goes. In the House, legislation gets referred to committee or maybe a subcommittee, gets reported to the full committee. If it gets reported out, it goes to the House Rules Committee to set up the rules for debate. House debate and passage. If it passes, it goes to the Senate. Senate follows a similar process. If they need to hash out anything, they go to conference. They figure that out, goes to the White House. The president vetoes it or signs it. Pretty simple. Okay. All right. So what time is it now? It is 7 o'clock, just to say 6:59. So pretty good. All right. So I'm going to stop the share for a second here. All right. So you made it through the chapter on Congress. There's a lot there, but I'd encourage you to make sure you're focused on that chapter and focused on the PowerPoint that I'll post. There's a lot to cover there. So there'll be a substantial number of questions on those terms, concepts in Congress. All right, so what I'm going to do now is go ahead and pause the recording. Again. All right, we are back. Let me share my screen again. All right, so again, so as we're moving through these institutions, we need to talk about, we talked about Congress, we'll talk about the courts. Again, you've all done well on the first two exams. You kind of know what my questions are like, right? We're not down in the weeds, so you can start to see if I'm focusing with the things I'm focusing on, where you should be focusing as well. So let me make sure I can pull up my chat so I have it. Okay. All right, so let's go. All right, so we've seen this when we talked about civil liberties and civil rights, with those two important concepts, we see how influential the courts are. So we kind of have to talk about, where the courts get their power from, and we talked about with Congress where their enumerated powers are found. We'll talk about that with the executive too, but it's really important to talk about, continue our conversation about how influential the courts are and the role that they play in our system of government. So Alexis Tocqueville talked about in his examination of the United States and the culture and the government, is famous for saying that scarcely any political question arises in the United States that is not resolved sooner or later into a judicial question, right? So what does that mean, right? When disputes come about, or right, people question the constitutionality of a law, whether people disagree on an issue, how to interpret the law, right? Where does it go? It goes to the courts. The courts have this important job of deciding those issues, right? So you have to, so we want to look at where the sources of American law come from, right? So first we'll talk about judge-made law, right? So we have common law, right? So what is common law, right? It's judge-made law that originated, it's this idea that originated in England, from decisions shaped according to prevailing custom, right? So decisions were applied to similar situations and gradually became common to the nation, right? That's where common law comes from. Decisions that are made, right, and say, okay, well, this next one, right, it's pretty much a similar case. Okay, we're going to take that and apply that previous decision to the next, right? So there's this idea of, right, this judge-made decision, right, being applied to different situations, right? What do we call that? We call that precedent, right? So a court ruling bearing on subsequent legal decisions in similar cases, right? So the common law, and what do we do in common law? We apply precedent, right? And then what's stare decisis? So stare decisis is a judge's dedication, essentially, to applying precedent, right? So this is kind of a judge's obligation, right? Stare decisis is the judge's obligation to follow previous judicial opinions and to apply those decisions accordingly and follow them, right? So it literally means to stand on decided cases, stare decisis. It's very important in our system, right? So why is precedent, why is stare decisis so important? Well, it's because as Neil Gorsuch talked about during his confirmation hearings, talked about determinacy of law, right? To being able to know, right? The importance of the rule of law requires, it necessitates that judges apply the law not fairly, but equally, right? So that you're going to apply the law the same way in each situation so that we understand it, so we can kind of organize our lives accordingly, right? If we do this, we know the consequence. If we do this, we know the consequences because judges follow that precedent, right? What are some other sources of American law, right? We have constitutions. We have our U.S. Constitution. We have state constitutions. Okay. We have statutes and administrative regulations. And then, we have this big body of case law, judicial interpretations of common law, principles and doctrines, as well as interpretations of constitutional law, statutory law, and administrative law. Right. Sometimes they're right. It's a little bit clearer. Sometimes this case law seems to be at odds with each other. the courts have to figure that out, right? Why the judges and justices have to figure out what cases have to be applied in a situation. And lawyers argue, right? If lawyers are up against a substantial amount of case law that might go against them, they have to argue why that case law shouldn't be applied to the current situation, right? So they have to try to differentiate between the cases, right? And that's why you have so much case law, because you're typically deciding on, minute issues or small issues. Not you might say, okay, this case is similar to these cases, but this one component is different, and that's the component we have to rule on. So cases can be seen as similar, but have some important differences as well. Some other sources of American law is this concept of judicial review, right? In judicial review, we talk about Marbury versus Madison. It's the case that essentially established judicial review. The power of the Supreme Court or any court to hold a law or other legal action is unconstitutional. So that's where we get, right? The courts are doing this, right, a lot, right? Not just saying, okay, who is right, who is wrong, but saying, right, this law shouldn't even exist, or this law is fine, right? You might challenge it on constitutional grounds, but it passes constitutional muster. From state laws, more than 1,000 have been declared unconstitutional, much more than the acts of the U.S. Congress. Less than 200 times an act has been declared unconstitutional. Why is that? Well, Congress, they're full-time legislators, they have substantial staffs, they have substantial resources. A lot of the work goes in ahead of time while legislation is being crafted. Hey, is this going to pass constitutional muster? What do we have to change so that it's not ruled unconstitutional? So they do that a lot of times ahead of the game before legislation goes through the elaborate process of going through the House or the Senate, going over the other chamber, conferencing, addressing that, all those issues. They want to ensure that the legislation is constitutional first. So judicial review. So we have to look where it's found in the Constitution. If we look at Article 3 of the Constitution, guess what? When it comes to the courts, it's nowhere to be found, right? It doesn't explicitly say that the courts have the ability to engage in judicial review, but nonetheless, it's been accepted since Marbury versus Madison. You can say, okay, who else is going to do it? If the court, if Congress or the president acts outside their purview, their constitutional purview, who's going to decide that, right? Are they supposed to check themselves? And a lot of people argue that yes, Congress is supposed to provide that own internal judicial review, or that own review, the constitutional review, and that's where it should be left. But nonetheless, culturally, we've accepted this concept of judicial review. So what can courts act on, right? What cases do courts get involved in? When can they get involved? When can they say, look, there's no standing or there's not a federal question, right? So the courts have to look at what their limits are as well, right? We have separation of powers. The courts are no different than the other two branches. They can't bleed into the other two. The U.S. Constitution limits jurisdiction of federal courts to cases involving a federal question, which is a question based on, at least in part, on the U.S. Constitution, a treaty, or federal law. So if you're saying, okay, well, I want to raise this issue, I don't, my neighbor is being a pest, so I'm going to sue him in federal court. Well, what's the question? Is he violating your property rights? Is he, what's going on to where you're bringing it to federal court? If it doesn't involve the U.S. Constitution or state statute, or a federal statute or a treaty or something like that, right? The courts aren't going to hear it, the federal courts. And then diversity of citizenship, right? We have in our federal system, we have multiple different players, right? So diversity of citizenship arises when parties to a lawsuit are from different states or when the lawsuit involves a foreign citizen or government. right? So you're diverse citizens, right? Different states, different countries, right? And the state court can't handle that, right? There's conflicts. It goes up to the federal courts, right? So Marbury versus Madison set that precedent of judicial review. And people ask this question. I'm not going to talk about that now in the interest of time, but right, people have continued to have these debates about whether the U.S. Constitution should be amended to explicitly grant the Supreme Court the power of judicial review, and would there be any benefits to such an amendment? I don't know. I mean, it's essentially accepted now. I don't know if an amendment would do that, or if it's just important to say, okay, yes, right, the Supreme Court should have this ability if that's important on its own. I don't know, but that debate is had, continues to be had. So the courts define separation of powers between branches, right? They go not only what's constitutional from a legislative standpoint, but they say when is Congress or the president or a member of the executive overstepped? When are they bleeding over into the other branches, right? So they enforce the separation of powers, right? For example, right, the legislative veto is unconstitutional. So a legislative veto is when the legislature says, okay, we're going to pass this legislation, but it's going to, when it goes to the executive, and the executive has to come up with a plan on how they're going to implement this, and then that has to be approved by Congress. And Congress can veto that plan. Well, the court said no, like the job of the executive is to execute. So you can't get involved in that execution. If you don't like the way they're executing it, then you need to pass additional legislation. You don't get to veto it and say, come up with a new plan. Once you give it to them to execute, they get to execute it, and you have to change everything else legislatively. In addition, the president on his or her own has no authority to set up military tribunals at Guantanamo Bay, right? The courts have said that's a legislative function. If you do that, you've overstepped your constitutional powers. All right. So the courts have a role to play in enforcing those boundaries. All right, so let's take a look at the federal court system in and of itself. What does it look like? How is it designed? That's really important, right? The Constitution itself, the U.S. Constitution itself, talks about a Supreme Court, right? But it doesn't talk about, right? They talk about, right, other courts that Congress deems necessary. All the other, the rest outside the Supreme Court and what the Supreme Court, the makeup is, it just talks generally about a Supreme Court. But the members of the Supreme Court and the appeals court, the district courts, the specific jurisdiction courts, right? Those are all statutory construction, right? Congress has created those court systems. So it's important to look at what they look like now, right? So there's 52 court systems in the U.S. today, right? You have the 52 states, you have the the court system in the District of Columbia, and then the federal court system. So 52 court systems, right? This is how it looks, right? So you have on the right-hand side, the state system, right? The federal system on the left, right? So you have issues can go through the state trial courts, go to the state appellate courts, can go to the state Supreme Courts. And then if it involves a federal question, it can take the leap over to federal court, go into the U.S. Supreme Court. Issues that involve directly a federal question start in the U.S. district courts, go through the appeals courts, and then possibly, we'll talk about that, possibly to the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Going to the Supreme Court is not a guarantee, and unless the Supreme Court is the court of original jurisdiction. So, all right. So the federal court system, so basic judicial requirements, they look at jurisdiction. The authority of a court to decide certain cases, right? Does it fall within their purview? Where should this case be heard? Is the state court the right area? Is the federal court? That's all important. Not all courts have the authority to decide all cases. Two jurisdictional issues are where a case arises, as well as its subject matter. And so that has to be all sorted out. We've talked about this, the diversity of citizenship is kind of a duplicate there. But people in federal court, you have to have a standing to sue. If you've met the threshold of having a federal question, okay, and they're, for whatever the case is, now you have to show that you have a standing to sue. And cases are dismissed for this all the time, right? You're not, right? You don't have a sufficient stake in the outcome of the matter, right? If you're saying, okay, I'm going to sue on behalf of so-and-so, okay? And well, yeah, but what's your stake in it? You don't have stake. You don't have standing, right? So it's got to be individuals, parties to the particular case that have a sufficient stake. It must be justiciable, right? It has to be something that the courts can decide on. You know, that they have the ability, the authority to decide. It's not something that they can remedy, right? There might not be a remedy that the courts can provide. If they can't provide a remedy, they're not going to hear the case. And no American court will give an opinion on a hypothetical case. You see that all the time in judicial hearings, right? Well, what is your feeling on this? What is your feeling on this? How would you rule on this? And what do the nominees say at the Supreme Court? You'll see this at the district court and appeals court as well. What do they say, right? I can't, that case could come before me. I can't offer, advisory opinions, right? That's what they call them, these advisory opinions. Courts won't do that because then it's already, they're already putting themselves, into a hole to where you're saying, well, I have to decide this way. This is what I said. They have to keep an open mind, hear evidence, hear the information, and decide everything on a case-by-case basis. So the different courts, there's trial courts, there's 94 district courts, right? So in the US system, there's a trial court. That's where most cases are heard. That's where where most of them begin. There's general jurisdiction courts, where they can hear most cases. Those particular courts can hear most cases. They hear a broad range of cases. There's limited jurisdiction court, where they hear cases, like specific cases, like tax claims, bankruptcy petitions. You have FISA courts that we've heard a lot about, right? So there are specific courts for specific things, but there are general jurisdiction courts as well. Then you have the appellate court, right? So it goes from, if a case needs to be reviewed, it goes to the appellate courts and it reviews cases that were originally tried in lower courts. All right. And when it comes to appeals, U.S. district courts or appeals courts, they typically don't look at questions of fact, but questions of law, right? So what do I mean by that? So, you provide evidence in a court, right? Both sides, you present evidence, you make arguments, you say this is what the facts are. You're not doing that in an appeals court. What you're saying is, what are these matters of law? Saying, okay, well, let's say my rights were violated because the jury shouldn't have heard this evidence. This evidence should have been struck from being shown or from preventing the jury from hearing that evidence, right? So you're deciding, like, what's constitutional? Does this follow, right? Is within our procedures, was this appropriate? You're not deciding whether or not, you're not looking at the facts and saying, okay, was this decided? Was it guilt or innocence decided correctly? No, you're looking at the more procedurals. Were procedures followed? Was the Constitution applied? Were there any violations? Things of that nature. All right. An appellate court will only challenge a trial court's finding on facts when it's clearly contrary to the evidence presented at trial. Typically, if there's an issue of law or facts, they'll remand it to a lower court to be able to make, have another hearing, have another trial, whatever the case might be. So when it comes to U.S. Federal Appeals Court, when it gets to that level, right, if it comes from there, right, if that's your first appeal, whatever the case might be, you're going to get that appeal. That's going to be heard, okay? But at that level, most decisions are final. Anybody know why? Why are most decisions at that level final? Who can help me out? Well, the reason is very few cases make it to the Supreme Court. So if you're the federal appeals court, and the next step is the Supreme Court, and very few cases are heard at the Supreme Court level, right? The appeals court is most likely your last stop on that train. Okay. So if you look at it, right, you have the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, right? You have the Court of International Trade, Federal Crimes, Veteran Appeals. That goes into the Court of Appeals for Federal Circuit. That goes to the Supreme Court. Then you have the other system, the other courts, right? The district courts, the tax courts, they go through their own Court of Appeals to the Supreme Court. But that said, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, that's where the buck stops most of the time. This is just you have one in your book as well. This shows the geographic boundaries of the federal district courts and circuit court of appeals, right? See, so the states there, right, you have, right, in District 5, right, you have Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. It kind of just breaks down, right? We have, obviously, they're broken down regionally, right? Population plays a role in how many courts there are as well. All right. Talked a little bit about that. The specialized federal courts in the war on terrorism. That's important, right? You have the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Survey Act, right? Dealing with, right, monitoring potential terrorists. You go to a special court. Call it a secret court, right? Because it's not open, right? It's not open to be challenged, right? You don't bring in the person you want to surveil into the court and have them, talk about, challenge evidence, things like that, right? Because you're trying to do that secretively, so they don't know you're surveilling them. So the officials don't have to reveal the suspect or the public the public information that was used to justify the warrant, right? It's a secret court, right? And Congress created that FISA court too. That's been obviously under scrutiny in recent years as well. And also, we've been talking a lot about this alien removal courts, right? Looking at due process, right? Enemy combatants, all of these things going on when it comes to the immigration process. Okay. Any questions about any of that, right? The court system, the structure, things like that. All right, so if we talk about everything, ultimately comes it becomes an issue that is brought to the courts. It becomes justiciable, and it's decided by the courts. Who are the players in the system, right? So think about this. This will be really important as well for your exam, right? Understanding who the plaintiff, the defendant, the litigant, litigants are, what it means to litigate, class action suits. These are all important concepts we hear a lot about. Who's the plaintiff, right? The plaintiff's the individual or the organization that initiates a lawsuit. Defendants are the individuals or organizations that are responding to the lawsuit, right? They're defending themselves against it. When we talk about litigation, what we're talking about is engaging in a legal proceeding in seeking relief in a court of law, right? To basically carry on the lawsuit. So we're going to litigate this. You hear that? We're going to litigate this issue. It means we're going to go to court, going to go through the process, right? Follow all the procedures, present evidence, so provide arguments, all this good stuff, right? And then it'll go through its legal process and it'll come to an end, and we'll get the outcome. And so you can have individuals, right? You can have companies, you can have states, the federal government can be a party to a lawsuit. You can have class action lawsuits. And it's a lawsuit filed by an individual seeking damage for all persons similarly situated, right? So you see a lot of these class action suits when it comes to the use of tobacco or to different medications that have caused problems, right? So they bring this up to strengthen their case. They bring up all these cases to show kind of these patterns of what went on. So you kind of get class action, right? Talk about a user of a particular product or a group, right? So what role do interest groups? We just got done talking about interest groups. Do they play a role in this process? Absolutely. Why? Because it goes beyond just the litigants in the case that have a stake in the outcome. There's interest groups, there's others that have a interest in how the cases shake out. So what do interest groups do? Right? Interest groups help bring cases to trial, right? What do? They provide resources, right? Financial resources. They provide legal advice, legal representation. A lot of times they can go out and shop cases, find a case. If they want to bring an issue, they'll shop a case. And they find a good case that they think they have a good shot at winning on, and they bring it to trial, right? So they do all of these things because they're trying to get, right, to create a precedent on a particular issue. Mostly civil liberties cases, or cases involving business matters are important, right? They file amicus briefs, right? We call them amicus curiae briefs, friend of the court briefs. There might not be a party to a case, but they care about the outcome. So what they're going to do is they're going to provide their own resources. Attorneys are going to create a brief and submit this brief so that the judges or justices hopefully look at it. And what they're doing in that brief is making an argument for one side or the other. And they're pointing in one direction of case law or another to try to convince judges or justices to rule one way or the other, right? Okay, so you're not a party to the case, but you're trying to have an impact and bring information to bear. You offer this information so that you can hopefully sway the court, right? So we talk about, right, the outcome of the case, how important precedent is. We talk about that a lot and how important precedent is to the determinacy of law. But within the system, while cases are being heard, the process of bringing cases is very important, right? There's procedural rules in the state and federal courts that must be followed. Why? So that there's this equal process. Everybody's on the same playing field. Everybody knows the rules, right? What you can expect from one side or the other. Everybody's playing with the same set of rules, and you have to follow those rules. So that goes to this idea of rule of law and due process as well, having these procedural rules set up. And if there's consequences for violating those rules. There's civil contempt, where you fail to comply with a court order for the benefit of another party in a proceeding. And you can have criminal contempt, right? Where you obstruct justice or you're disrespecting the court. So like for failure to follow a court's ruling, failure to follow procedure, you can be in contempt, right? Because it's, right, these rules are established for a reason. And you can follow this link and look at all the daunting, if you ever wanted to, right? If you needed to doze off, you can look at all these rules and procedures, but they're set up so that everyone knows the rules of the game. All right, so we talked a lot about the Supreme Court, the appellate courts being, right, the last stop on a legal case in most cases, because most cases don't reach the Supreme Court. Cases reviewed by SCOTUS represent about 0.5% of all cases decided each year. So, that's not a lot of cases, but they're the focus of all our energy, right? Their national energy would say, oh, well, who's being appointed to the Supreme Court? What cases are they hearing? How are they going to rule? And how is this going to impact us, right? That's where we tend to focus. We don't really hear too much about district court cases until it gets up to appeals court. And we hear a lot about it when it gets to the Supreme Court because they're not hearing a lot of cases. But they have a substantial impact. And how can they influence the nation's policies? Well, they issue decisions in some cases, right? And in some cases, they refuse to hear appeals. So what does that mean? they're influencing policy by not hearing cases. So let's say a case is decided in one district appeals court, well, that's only gonna, if the Supreme Court's not gonna take up that case, then that precedent is only gonna apply in that particular district. So, right, they're saying, well, we're not gonna apply this to the whole nation. We're just not gonna take up the issue, right? It should just be a regional issue, whatever the case might be, right? Do you have an absolute right to appeal to SCOTUS? No, you do not, right? You have a right to an appeal, but not an appeal to SCOTUS. So what facts? So if they're taking so few cases, how do they decide what cases they do? The justices on the Supreme Court, how do they decide what cases are important to take up? What factors bear on their decision? Well, a legal question has that's been decided by lower courts. They decided differently by lower courts. Supreme Court says, okay, well, now we're going to get out of control. This court said this court said this. This is an issue that it's probably going to come up again. We need to sort this out so that there's consistency with the issue. If a court case conflicts with a previous SCOTUS decision, they're more likely to take that up because to set the record straight and to clarify where they stand on that case. And then whether an issue could have significance beyond the parties to this dispute. If it's a one-off case where it's like, oh, this is such a bizarre case, it's a one-off, or it's not going to really happen too often, then we'll probably leave it alone. But if it's an issue that's going to continue to come up and it has significance beyond those two parties, right? If we see this happening again, or it's happening a lot in a variety of different places, Supreme Court's more likely, not definitely, they won't definitely do it, but they're more likely to pick that up. And then the Solicitor General of the U.S. Solicitor General has a lot of sway. SCOTUS takes up most of the cases brought that are of interest to the Solicitor General. Okay. So what happens? They decide to hear a case, right? So they'll issue a writ of certiorari, right? It's an order issued by a higher court to review a lower court and have them tell them to send up the record of a case for review. And the Supreme Court abides by the rule of 4, right? So 4 justices have to approve that writ, right? Have to approve that review of the case. And as I said, more than 90% of petitions for review are denied. So just remember, writ of certiorari, remember rule of 4, okay? SCOTUS normally does not hear any evidence. It's like appeals courts. You're not looking at facts. You're focused on matters of law. They consider their consideration of a case is based on abstracts, the record, and briefs. Okay, there are oral arguments where both sides present their case. They're peppered with questions from the justices, some more than others, but they're trying to address what the justices are concerned about or what the justices need clarification on. The statements and questions are audio recorded, and justices, like I said, can interrupt at any time and ask those questions, and that's right. That's their prerogative to do that. All right. Okay. So what comes out of these proceedings, right? What does it look like when a judge makes a decision, right? Well, they issue what we call opinions, right? So opinions are statements by a judge or court of the decision reached in a case. And the opinion sets forth the applicable law and details the reasoning on which the ruling was based. And we'll see that. You'll see that in subsequent court cases when something is being referenced. You say, okay, the opinions are referencing other court cases. It's basically showing their rationale, right? I'm connecting this case to this case for this reason, and I'm connecting this part of the case to these other cases for a reason. Here's my rationale. Here's how I got here, right? They're showing their work, okay? And so basically that becomes a record, right? That becomes case law that other attorneys and judges use, right? So when we talk about an appeals court, right, whether it be an appeal court, a Supreme Court, those courts do a few different things, right? they either affirm the lower court decision, right? They declare that a court ruling is valid and must stand, or they reverse the decision, say that they annul, they void the lower court's ruling and say there was some irregularity, we're changing that decision. Or they could remand it. They could say, send it back to a case that originally heard it with new instructions saying, okay, you have to leave this out, you can't do this, have a new case, but we're saying, all right, we're not gonna overrule you, but we're remanding it to say some things weren't followed, or something was awry, something was amiss here, and you need to have a new proceeding, new trial, whatever the case might be in your jurisdiction. All right. When it comes to appeals courts, when you have multiple judges of the Supreme Court, where we have multiple justices, right? You're voting, right? You have to get a majority to actually, right? You have to get five votes Supreme Court to be able to offer that opinion, right? So you can have a unanimous opinion, right? I think it happens more. A lot of times people talk about conservative justices and liberal justices. That's an oversimplification, but unanimous opinions don't happen all the time, but they probably happen more than you think. But that's where all the judges agree, right, on the outcome, right? They're saying, yeah, we all agree. They might have different rationales and things of how they got there, but they all agree. A majority opinion is a court opinion reflecting the views of the majority of the judges or justices. Okay, and then you can have a concurring opinion, right? Where you have a majority opinion and somebody writes the majority opinion, but someone wants to, another member of the court or justice wants to share a different way. They agree with the majority opinion, the outcome, but they didn't get to the outcome the same way as the majority opinion is written. So they write a concurring opinion, right? So they create it separately, and they say, okay, yes, I agree with the majority, but I don't agree with the rationale. Here's my rationale and why I say my rationale should be followed, right? That doesn't have, right? That doesn't carry the weight of a majority opinion because the majority opinion was counts, but you know, dissenting opinions and concurring opinions have been used to argue future cases in the courts, right? And what is a dissenting opinion, right? When a judge or justice feels strongly about an issue and they're in the minority, they're going to say, look, I'm going to make the case why the majority was wrong. And they put out an opinion that dissents from the majority opinion, okay? We've seen this happen where there's only 8 justices, right? Scalia dying in 2016, Ginsburg dying in 2020. What happens? Appointments get highly politicized. We saw that, with both of these vacancies. What are the consequences of having 8 justices? You could have gridlock, right? But not all the time, right? Doesn't mean that that will happen. It just can happen. You have that deadlock. You don't have that tie-breaking vote there all the time. Okay. So how are judges selected, right? District appeals and Supreme Court justices, right? You have presidential appointment, Senate confirmations, and that's how it goes. There could be presidents have abided by what we call senatorial courtesy in a federal district court. Judicial nominations are allowed by a senator. Like those nominations can be vetoed by a senator in that district if it involves his or her state. But that's not always followed. It has historically been, but there's been others, but Trump kind of bucked that system in certain circumstances. But you have in presidents, previous presidents, the current president, they'll decide on judicial appointments in a variety of different ways. Jimmy Carter created independent commissions. Ronald Reagan abolished that commission. He wanted to be directly involved in the selection of those nominees. As opposed to district courts, Federal appeals court appointments, presidents take a more active role in those appointments because, again, that's where the buck stops most of the time. But they can have Supreme Court appointments. And then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has an important role to play because he or she is the CEO of the federal judiciary. So you have 1,200 judges and 30,000 staff members. It's a big bureaucracy for the Chief Justice. So when we talk about confirmation, what are we talking about? We're talking about presidential appointment. We're talking about Senate confirmation. Ideology is very important. You look at Reagan and H.W. Bush. By 1993, they had appointed nearly 3/4 of all federal court judges. Clinton appointed 200 federal judges. W. Bush appointed 2 justices to the Supreme Court. Obama appointed 2 justices. And Trump, as we know, appointed had 3 SCOTUS appointments. Right? And that goes back to, right, he got to appoint for both the Scalia and Ginsburg vacancies. So a lot of times we talk about, right, we get all up in arms about how a court decides something. We say, okay, we categorize judges based on kind of the political ideological spectrum, and how they decide. Like I said, it's not that simple. There's other components to that, but we tend to look at how judges behave, and we hear these terms like judicial activism or judicial restraint. And when we're talking about judicial activism, and it's a doctrine that the Supreme Court should take an active role in using its powers to check activities of governmental bodies like Congress, the president, when those bodies exceed their authority. So going out and saying, look, we have a role to play. We're going to be active in this and asserting our authority to basically engage in this judicial review and to check the other branches. Judicial restraint is when the Supreme Court is more likely to defer to the elected representatives of the people in the legislative executive branches, saying, look, this is what, right, unless there's some significant constitutional issue, right, we need to let the elected members of the legislature and the executive make these rules, right? They're the ones that were elected, they're the closest to the people. If the people don't like what they're doing, they can vote them out. Right? Then we have these ideas of how you view law and the Constitution. You have strict constructionists, right? People point to Clarence Thomas, Scalia, as the strict constructionists, where it's a judicial philosophy that looks to the letter of the law when interpreting the Constitution or a particular statute. What was the letter of the law? What was discussed? What was being said at the time this law, the Constitution, was passed? Because what the clear, like the direct meaning of this, like what it says, is what it says. Right? It's again more complex than that, but saying, look, we're going to look to what the language clearly means. Right? We're not going to read into it. We're not going to look at kind of this context or what kind of the spirit of the law is. We're going to say, what does the law say? And that's going to be the interpretation. And then, because the opposing side of that is broad construction, right? So broad constructionists look at the context, right? What was the kind of the spirit of the law? What was the purpose, right? Does this achieve the purpose, right? In these particular cases, when they're making an interpretation, all right? Judicial activism is often linked with liberalism, and judicial restraint often with conservatism. That's not always the case. The Roberts Court has been kind of all over the place, been less predictable. A lot of people argue that Roberts, right, isn't so much of a conservative justice, more of a protectionist justice, right? Looking to protect the reputation of the federal court system, right? So folks argue that it's not about necessarily the outcome all the time. It's about protecting the reputation of the court for Roberts, right? So it's just something that's floated out there, and that's kind of been an explanation as to why his tenure as Chief Justice has been less predictable than at other periods of time, right? So we've talked about what checks Congress. Well, what checks the courts, right? So so you have executive checks, right? So judicial implementation, the way in which the court decisions are translated into action. Can courts enforce their own opinions? No, they cannot. Courts rely on Congress, courts rely on the executive to implement their decisions. If the executive refuses to implement decisions, we saw that in, segregation in the South, right? Where, some presidents were willing to take more action than others, right? But the courts can't enforce their own opinions. So the executives can have a role to play when it comes to judicial implementation. Like I said, courts don't have enforcement powers. They need cooperation of the other branches. Judicial appointments is another way to check the courts, right? Reagan, other presidents, Trump took an active role in the courts, Clinton, Obama, right? Who's getting appointed where, and when, how many can appoint, right? You can change the trajectory of the makeup of the court for generations to come, right? The U.S. Solicitor General and what he or she does, the cases that are brought, the cases that they choose to be an active participant in. And then the states can also refuse to implement court decisions as well, right? The states have a role, okay? We talk about desegregation in 1955. The Arkansas governor refused to cooperate with the decision, right? So you have that refusal. All right, what are some legislative checks, right? Appropriating funds to enforce rulings, right? Okay, we're just not going to appropriate funds, or we will appropriate funds. They can pass constitutional amendments. So the constitutional amendments, the 14th, 15th, 26th amendments, restricted the court's ability to allow discrimination. They can rewrite laws to overcome challenges by the courts. And then there's some that believe that public opinion can sway, right? As culture evolves over time, and public opinion changes, that the courts are sensitive to that as well. Right? So this here. All right, so judicial traditions and doctrines, we're just finishing up here, got a little bit left. We talked about hypothetical and political questions. They typically won't address the hypothetical, right? Political questions, what we mean is an issue that court believes should be decided by the executive branch. So if it's a matter of how to go about solving this issue, the courts will say that's a political issue. That needs to be decided in the legislature, okay? Or it needs to be in some administrative agency, right? That's not something we can decide or should decide because it's a political question. The SCOTUS can impact, well, if we look at the impact of lower courts, there's been time where lower courts have ignored SCOTUS decisions. Most of the time that's done indirectly by concluding that a precedent does not apply to the specific case at hand. A SCOTUS decision may be ambiguous regarding the issue before the lower court. So sometimes courts can, have an impact on kind of forcing the hand of SCOTUS to change direction when that happens. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Well, we got through a lot in a couple hours. We just had a short break. Appreciate you sticking with me here. I know it's a long couple hours, but that is it. We've gotten through important concepts in a reasonable amount of time. We'll get you out of here early, half hour early. I wanted to open it up since we are out, half hour, 35 minutes early. Wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions on material or the political cartoon or what's going to happen over the next 9 days. If you're concerned about anything, I've seen, got a student email this afternoon. I will address that on a particular issue. That's fine. But if there's anything you feel comfortable sharing or any questions that you think might benefit everybody, feel free. Is there any questions anybody has? All right. Well, I'm not gonna keep you any longer. If you want to hold back till everyone drops off and ask a question when everyone's off, that's fine too. But you can feel to. Do you have a question, Benjamin? Or you dropping off? He's just saying goodbye. So feel free to jump off. I will stay on until everybody else jumps off. But if there's nothing, have a good evening. And we'll see you next time.